Today we're going to talk about non-democracies. Non-democracies are not at all unusual. More than half of the countries in the world are not totally free. What you see here is a map of freedom published by Freedom House from 2013. And this gives you some idea. So the green are completely free, yellow are partly free, and purple are not free states. And what they do is they look at civil and political rights. And you can go to freedomhouse.org and you can look at their methodology. Might be of interest. There are several common characteristics of non-democracies. They are by nature opaque. They lack the transparency typical of democracies, where freedom of speech means the quick movement of information. So as I mentioned a while back, I spent a lot of time, we all spent a lot of time at the U.S. Embassy in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent, trying to figure out who, besides the president, was really in charge. Who was the inspiration for policies? Where were potential areas of fragmentation of the ruling elites? We never had a lot of luck because of this opaque nature of the regime. The second point is that these regimes are quite defensive. They lack a popular mandate, which means that they constantly are on the lookout for enemies. And the third point is that these regimes tend to rely on a mix of co-optation and repression to maintain control. Generally, the more serious the threat of the opposition, the more repression you're going to find. Repression can be widespread, but the worst of it tends to be targeted. Today we're going to talk about various non-democratic regime types: competitive authoritarianism, single-party regimes, military regimes, and theocracy. And then we'll talk about some strategies for maintaining non-democracies and dip into a couple dilemmas in democratization. We can define authoritarianism as a political regime in which a small group of individuals exercises power over the state without being constitutionally responsible to the public. The public has very little role in accountability, in other words, in choosing and removing these leaders, which means that policymakers essentially dictate policy. Limits on freedoms are used in order to maintain their dominance. A lack of rule of law is also used so that they are above the law. This doesn't mean that they're necessarily completely restrained, power-hungry actors, though they often are in practice. But some can have an institutionalized ideology, institutionalized rules of the game, what's possible and what's not possible, what's legal and what's not legal. They may well follow norms and legal rules when it's convenient, or for the most part, but they can also abrogate these when they want to. Other times we can have regimes that are much more personalistic and much more opaque. And we could talk about the benevolent versus the malevolent dictators here as well. Those dictators that are actually doing good for the general country and those that are actually doing harm to the country. So today we're going to talk about this range of non-democratic states. I'm going to start with illiberal regimes, illiberal democracies. We also call these competitive authoritarian regimes. You should be familiar with both of these names. These are states that are, they would have been yellow in the Freedom House. So most of these would fall into the yellow range here. Okay? And these are states in which they have the mechanisms, all the trappings of democracy, but they're very weakly institutionalized. We also refer to these as facade democracies. So, for example, you will find an independent press in a state like this, but it's going to be limited. It's going to be harassed to a certain degree. It's going to be dwarfed, more importantly, by the government-backed press, which has all of the resources. You'll find multiple parties, very real parties, with varying ideologies, varying policy goals, but they will also be limited. They'll be harassed. They will not be allowed, for example, freedom of movement completely. Civil society, same. It's going to be permitted to the degree that it's not a direct threat. And then once it is, it's going to be clamped down upon. And elections occur, okay? Regular elections, but they're neither free entirely nor fair. By free elections, we mean that everyone can vote and they can run for office. By fair elections, we mean that all those running are on the same playing field and there is no cheating, there is no fraud. In illiberal democracies or competitive authoritarian regimes, you will have opposition parties that can attain certain degrees of power, but never enough to take over the state. So a classic example of this was Yugoslavia before 2000. their opposition parties were allowed to function and contest in the elections. They even won seats in some elections. They even won mayoral races. But they were harassed. They weren't permitted freedom of movement. They weren't permitted freedom of assembly frequently. Supporters and their officials were sometimes arrested for brief periods under various pretexts. Their coverage in the opposition media was there, but the opposition media was tiny. They lacked media time in the state-controlled press, which dominated. And if they got too close to critical power positions, national dominance, they could ultimately be cheated, outright fraud. And this is in fact what we saw after the elections in 2000 when you had an uprising of sorts. So in summary, these are facade democracies that allow regimes to make claims about representativeness and legitimacy. And in this era where democratic legitimacy is the international norm, this can be important. Yet, despite the facade democracies, despite all the trappings of democracy, they're actually ensuring their own position through these other rights abuses. The next group we're going to talk about are single-party regimes. Here, we're talking about a monopoly over political power by one particular party. All others, those who are not in that party, are restricted, or they're co-opted, or they're eliminated. Single-party regimes use the party as a vehicle to gain control over the broader population. They incorporate various elements of society into the structures to increase broader acquiescence. They give material privileges to people within society who obey them, okay, or who support them actively. The structure is often hierarchical, with party dominance in national institutions, but also at the local government level, and even at the workplace levels. You will find the party everywhere. They have branches all over the place. The party serves as a mechanism for mobilization, which is designed to create the appearance of widespread enthusiasm and increase the risks of defection, of going against the party. So, for example, the case that we have here is the Soviet Union. The Communist Party penetrated the society and the state at every level. There were government positions, but they were reserved for good party members. And they were largely symbolic because the real power was at the top party levels. So, for example, you had the premier, who was the head of government, someone with a title. But really, the power was with the general secretary of the Communist Party. Now, sometimes the same person held both offices simultaneously, in which case you knew who was in charge. The Communist Party's Politburo functioned as a de facto cabinet. This was a very small circle within the Communist Party. Tiny, talking about less than a dozen people, and they were essentially the cabinet that ran the state, okay, under the guise of one leader, the general secretary. The party's central committee. This party's central committee functioned as a de facto rubber stamp legislature, and we'll find the same thing when we talk about China today. The Communist Party had a branch structure, which was replicated at various levels. That's how they could be represented everywhere, literally down to each factory, each school, each apartment block. So that, for example, if you need repairs in your apartment block, you have to go to the Communist Party representative of your apartment block to get those repairs done. And if you're not in well with the Communist Party, then the repairs probably won't get done. Second example is an interesting one, the case of Zimbabwe up until a few years ago. The Zimbabwe African National Union was Robert Mugabe's party, ZANU. It's ruled since independence in 1980, but by 1987, ZANU absorbed its ally, the Patriotic Front, and they made one party. They made this into a single-party state, the ZANU-PF state. The ZANU-PF was organized on a communist system template, but it had no communist ideology. It favored a mixed economic system until it became much more populist in 2000 when it pursued land seizures for the rural poor, as I mentioned when we talked about political economy. This is a party that encourages mass mobilization and essentially pays people to be members of their party. They can also force villagers to pay ZANU-PF dues in order to help sustain young ZANU-PF activists who are protected by the state. Now, all this has changed actually over the last several years, around 2008 when the movement for democratic change was allowed into a coalition government. And we continue to see the political evolution in Zimbabwe today. Another example of a single-party state is Mexico. And the picture that you see here is President Calles taking power from the start of the PRI rule in 1929. The PRI is the Institutional Revolutionary Party, established in 1929 to represent quote unquote Mexican state interests. Here again, the single party there was a single party, but it really lacked an ideology. Sometimes it was more leftist, sometimes more rightist. So this isn't just about communist parties. This isn't just about ideological parties, like Hitler's National Socialist Party. In order to maintain power, the PRI focused on patron-client relationships. The government would give state services and access to power in return for political support. They used informal networks of political cliques, which became incredibly important to running the state. The PRI was historically capable of huge mobilization, especially workers and peasants, whose organizations were brought into the PRI structure, and businesses, which gave the PRI lots of campaign money, not that they really needed it at the end of the day. But their support began to erode in 1982 as urbanization led to better educated, wealthier, and a more politically independent class. And the poor economy also damaged the PRI's ability to use patronage and to co-opt the actors that they had historically co-opted. The neoliberal economic reforms in the early 1990s hurt even more, but we'll talk about this when we get to Mexico. So to summarize here, there are various types of single-party regimes. Some are ideologically driven, some are more the party of power, but all of them mobilize using these various mechanisms. In all of them, the party has an important role in running the state and mobilizing the population, which allows the party to maintain its image and, by default, the reality of party strength. So we'll now go into the second part when we get into military regimes.